It's Friday, September 27th, 2024, and we are 38 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, Kamala Harris is at the U.S. southern border as I'm recording this, as she tries to drive home her immigration plan. So it seemed to me like it'd be a good day to compare and contrast the plans that Harris and Trump have for immigration. And I talk with Mike Madrid today, co-founder of the Lincoln Project and the author of the fantastic new book, The Latino Century, all about what both parties get wrong about Latino voters and how they can get them back. But first, here are your headlines. On Monday, the Department of Justice said it found a note written by accused would-be shooter Ryan Routh, the man who tried to kill former President Trump while he was on his golf course in West Palm Beach, Florida. The note clearly stated that Routh intended on killing the former president. Now, it was left in a box that was dropped off at the home of a person the DOJ did not identify. The box also had ammunition, a metal pipe, tools, a phone, and other building materials inside of it. That person called authorities once they opened the box. A law enforcement also said that they found a note in Routh's car that had on it other dates and locations of where Trump would be. And then on Tuesday, a Florida judge, actually the same judge overseeing the Mar-a-Lago documents case, allowed an upgraded charge to be added to Routh's case, which was attempted killing of a presidential candidate. Also on Monday, Boeing said it made its final offer to the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers who have been on strike since September 13th. The offer was for a 30% pay increase. Workers have been asking for a 40% increase. That final offer was rejected by the union. Now, that happened as the United States Maritime Alliance, which is the group that represents the companies that control the U.S. seaports, and the International Longshoremen's Association said they could not reach a deal, and some 45,000 dock workers are set to strike this coming Tuesday. The strike alone would have a huge impact on shipping just before the holiday season and could send the economy into a tailspin. That would also undoubtedly affect the election, particularly for Democrats, who could get a residual blowback from people angry at the union, but I'm definitely going to be doing a mini episode on this next week. On Wednesday, Congress passed a continuing resolution to keep the government funded for the next 3 months. The deal, which was hard-fought for House Speaker Mike Johnson, which I've talked about before, backs him into a corner because he needed to work with Democrats in order to get it passed, and it went against the explicit wishes of former President Trump. The agreement passed the Senate, and President Biden signed that bill Thursday afternoon as members of Congress rushed out of Washington to avoid an incoming hurricane. The government will remain open until December 20th, when we'll do this whole thing all over again. On Thursday, the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, was indicted on bribery and accepting contributions from a foreign government, among a few other charges. According to prosecutors, Adams, a former police officer who ran for mayor as a law and order Democrat, had been accepting plane tickets, luxury hotel stays in foreign countries, and illegal campaign donations in exchange for helping Turkish officials in New York City, notably on getting through safety inspections on the new Turkish high-rise consulate in New York. Now, New York Governor Kathy Hochul, who can remove Adams, said she was still thinking about her next decision. Adams has vowed to stay in office. And finally, on Thursday, Hurricane Helene slammed into Florida's Gulf Coast as a Category 4 hurricane with speed winds of 125 to 140 miles per hour. While evacuations had been happening for several days, those who stayed were being encouraged to mark their homes with the number of people inside for first responders and mark their own bodies with their names and social security numbers in case they don't survive the storm and get washed away. The massive storm had placed hundreds of miles across several states under flash flood warnings and knocked out power to more than 3 million homes across several states as I'm recording this. It also had the potential to create a nightmare storm surge, according to forecasters, of more than 20 feet, with the potential to wreak havoc on what's known as Florida's Big Bend area along the Gulf, including the capital of Tallahassee. Storm warnings have been issued for as far north this weekend as Virginia and the Carolinas. Okay, that is it for your headlines. Let's get to our main topic this week, what the candidates have planned for immigration. Immigration is always an animating issue for voters, Republicans in particular, meaning that it really revs their political engines. 82% of Republicans said it was a very important issue to them, making it the second most important issue for Republicans. But for voters overall, it was the sixth most important issue behind things like healthcare, crime, and Supreme Court nominations. But because it's such a huge issue on the right and it's Donald Trump's original issue, it is the first thing he said about getting into the 2016 race, immigration dominates news coverage and, by extension, how campaigns get covered. And since we already talked about him here, let's start with Trump. His plans are pretty widely known on a surface level kind of a thing because he talks about them all the time. But honestly, when they're right up next to one another, it's hard not to describe them as anything less than a massively bleak departure from what the U.S. has done in the past under Democratic and Republican presidents alike. Now, there are more than a dozen policy points that his campaign has outlined, but I'm just going to highlight some of the biggest ones. So the main plan that Trump has is he wants to begin a massive deportation program of 11 million undocumented people living in the U.S. right now. Trump has said he thinks that number is nearing 20 million, but no reliable source has a number that high. The highest end of estimates caps out at around 14 or 15 million people. The plan to deport that many people would be a domestic military operation that would take years, according to the campaign. And Trump has said in the past that it would mean moving thousands of immigration and customs enforcement agents from the southern border into states, cities, and towns to conduct raids, including workplace raids, which would inevitably be targeting some of the country's largest food producers and manufacturers that rely on undocumented labor. And to make up for the loss of agents at the border, he would call home thousands of military members currently stationed overseas, many of them in allied countries, and station those service members at the border. It would also mean the federal government would need to set up massive holding camps for the people arrested in these immigration raids because the current facilities would not be able to hold that many people. Trump has said that those what would effectively be internment camps would be along the southern border no matter where the people taken had been living before. Now, this plan would be incredibly expensive. Right now, Trump hasn't laid out an actual figure, but one estimate from the American Action Forum found that it could cost up to $300 billion to just start the program, and then another $315 billion to maintain it each year. Economists from the Wharton School of Business, which is also Trump's alma mater, found that over 10 years, the plan would cost the economy easily $1 trillion in labor and revenue lost. Trump has also said that he used defense budget money to pay for this program, but when he tried that during his time in office when it came to building the wall on the southern border, it was deemed illegal by courts, so it's unclear how this time would be any different. Trump said he would also end the Biden administration's immigration parole program. It just lets people who are in the U.S. illegally be released into the country on parole if they're still in the application process to be allowed in or in the process of being allowed to work in the country. Now, this is talked about under a blanket of policies, sometimes offensively called catch and release. And it's usually talked about on the right as just letting people off scot-free into the country. But the American Immigration Council found that 83% of undocumented immigrants show up to their court dates, which is actually higher than U.S. citizens who are called to court each year. The next part of the plan would be to end birthright citizenship. Now, this has long been something Trump has called to end. Birthright citizenship is exactly what it sounds like. If you're born on U.S. soil, you're a citizen, no matter who your parents are. He would have some trouble ending it because it's part of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that was ratified in order to give citizenship to freed slaves. Some legal scholars think that it could be partially done by federal law, though likely not by executive order, which is what Trump is promising in this campaign and what he promised in a campaign video back in 2023. There was a bill that was in the House that had almost 3 dozen co-sponsors that would narrow the understanding of birthright citizenship to at least one legal U.S. citizen parent or non-citizen serving in the military. Trump would also have a carve-out section banning what's called birth tourism. Now, Trump has meant this in the past to be something that birth tourism isn't. The myth that people come into the country illegally, have a baby, and then use that baby to delay deportation, to elude law enforcement, quote unquote. Both Trump, the candidate, and Trump, the president, have described this as a loophole that needs closing. But the truth is that having a child in the country doesn't actually mean a parent or parents won't get deported. That's just not part of U.S. law. Birth tourism is actually the practice where mostly wealthy people from countries like Russia and China will vacation in the U.S. while they're in their last trimester or longer, have their baby here, ensuring that that baby is now a U.S. citizen, and then go home. The dual citizenry of their kids is seen as sort of a status symbol in those circles, and it's often used for business connections for their families later in life. Now, Trump has said he thinks birth tourism is being used to game the green card or visa system in the U.S., but there's also no real evidence of that either. And speaking of green cards, Trump wants to give green cards to foreign students who graduate from a U.S. university or college as long as they pass ideological screening that Trump wants to implement for all immigrants. That would screen people who are, according to the campaign, jihadists, members of Hamas, or sympathetic to Hamas. Trump also said he would deport pro-Palestinian college students, which it's worth pointing out a couple things here. First, being pro-Palestinian doesn't mean being pro-Hamas. Also, it's unclear how Trump would get around First Amendment protections about freedom of religion or expression for both those students, but also immigrants in that ideological screening, because legal or not, constitutional rights apply to everyone in the U.S., no matter your legal status. Trump would also bring back a lot of the policies that he wanted in his first term, including banning immigration from certain Muslim countries, refunding and rebuilding the wall, and ending temporary protected status, which is what most recently immigrants from places like Haiti have been living in under U.S. law. Now, before we move on to Harris, I think it's important to talk about the person behind these policies. Trump's immigration czar is a guy named Stephen Miller. Miller is an anti-immigration hardliner, to put it mildly. He's called for putting an end to asylum seeking, ending refugee programs, and has on more than one occasion talked about great replacement theory, which is the white nationalist theory that immigrants are being sent to the U.S. to replace white people. Miller was also the subject of a deep investigation by the Southern Poverty Law Center's Hate Watch outfit, which tracks hate and extremists across the country. Not exactly a group that you want doing a deep dive on your life. Miller was caught sending white nationalist propaganda and supporting white supremacist ideas in emails that he sent to the far-right outlet Breitbart, which included some of the same readings that are spread by neo-Nazis. And this is the guy who would be running the Trump administration's immigration plans. Okay, let's leave Trump and his administration and talk about Harris. Harris has struggled to break away from her job in the Biden White House. She was labeled the border czar by various news outlets, and Trump and other critics on the right have seized on that. It was a pretty poor way to describe what her job actually was in the Biden White House. She was in charge of working the diplomatic channels between the U.S. and Central American nations to help solve the root problems of immigration and why people were fleeing those countries. She was not in charge of border security, but as president, she would be. So Harris has repeatedly said that she would support the bill that was in Congress, written by one of the most conservative senators in the country, Oklahoma's James Lankford, and she said she would sign that into law if it landed on her desk and she was president. Now, that bill would allow Border Patrol to hire about 1,500 more Border Patrol agents, including bringing some agents out of retirement. It would also give the federal government, so the president, the ability to close off legal entries to the U.S. if daily totals went above 4,000 people, and it would trigger an automatic closure if that number hit 5,000 crossings, and the border would stay closed for 7 days or until those numbers dropped. Now, there are exceptions to that, including certain kinds of asylum seekers already in the process of applying for asylum, refugees, non-Mexican children, and of course, those who cross illegally because legislation can't physically close a border. It would, however, overhaul the asylum system too. It would raise the bar for whether someone is genuinely at risk in their home country from credible asylum seeking to reasonable asylum seeking. And now I know that sounds like semantics, but when it comes down to the law and who gets to be in the country, it's not. According to the American Immigration Council, about 65% of asylum seekers pass the credible threshold, while just 44% past the reasonable threshold. So a drop of 20% in asylum seekers is huge. It would also allow for the hiring of more asylum judges and officers to get through cases faster because there's quite a big backlog right now. It would also allow for lawyers specifically for children and especially those who are here without their parents. Harris also supported the portion of the bill that would fast-track immigration for Afghan allies, the translators, the workers and their families who helped American and Allied soldiers for more than 20 years during the war in Afghanistan. It would, however, cap that number at 10,000 immigrants, which is far lower than most experts think is needed. The bill would also increase legal immigration for the first time in 30 years by allowing more people to access green cards for just the first 5 years after this law is passed. And the green card system is terribly backlogged, with people sometimes waiting more than a decade to get their official visa statuses. Now, finally, it would also make immigration and customs have clear alternatives to detention centers for when the official ones get too full. It would also raise the number of beds that facilities need to have on hand from about 35,000 beds to 50,000 beds. That's a big one because human rights groups and civil rights groups have been criticizing the Biden and Harris administration for years for allowing the vast majority of detained immigrants to be in private detention centers, which have repeatedly been found to have really awful conditions. Now, in 2020, Harris talked about the need to end private immigration detention centers as a cottage industry, as they've kind of become, but her campaign doesn't have anything about that on her website, and I wasn't able to find her talking about this in any way during this campaign. Now, when it comes to the other side of immigration, meaning the actual immigrating part, like how people can actually get into the U.S. instead of just how we're going to keep people out, Harris has said that she wants there to be a meaningful pathway to citizenship, but she hasn't really fleshed that out as I'm recording. And I will say, Harris's immigration plan is really thin. I mean, her campaign page is just a single paragraph, and it's almost entirely about that bill that I just talked about. Now, that could be because it's just the fix that she wants, and that bill failed because Donald Trump told Republicans not to pass it. So in Trump's mind, it would have been giving Biden a win on a key issue during an election, and Trump didn't want that, but Harris putting this forward as her plan, as one that she likes, and one she also gets to hit Trump with, might be the direction and the reason they're choosing this as her immigration plan. But I do find it surprising that she doesn't have a bigger playbook on this, given how big Trump's is. But also, she could just be outlining that right now on the border, because she's there as I'm talking, and my guess is tomorrow's mini will be what she did and didn't say about any new border plans. The other thing that we talk about when we talk about the border, most of the American press, and thus most Americans, end up talking about Latino and Hispanic voters and thinking about Latino and Hispanic voters when we talk about the border. My guest today has made it very clear for a long time that Latinos are more than immigration and border security, and the party that figures that out first will be in office for a long time. Coming up, my conversation with Republican consultant, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, and author of the great new book, The Latino Century, Mike Madrid. Start by saying thank you for teaching what cabron means. I had a high school Spanish teacher who would call me that frequently and then never told me what it meant.
That's the first time someone's opened an interview like that. But yeah, that's great. Happy to help.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Here to advise and assist.
3 years I was called pain in the ass. But thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I want to start with your take on the landscape of Hispanic, Latino voters. I think we can use those interchangeably. Even though, you know, but where do things sit right now when it comes to parties reaching out to Hispanic voters, because nobody seems to be doing it well?
Yeah, that was Grant. That was the purpose of the book. It's kind of explaining, like, there's this rapidly emerging electorate, and it's not small, it's enormous. Right. Almost 40% of Latino voters, and Latino voters surpassed the Black vote in 2020 as the largest ethnic voting group in the country. Almost 40% of our voters are under the age of 30. 20% of all Latino voters will be voting in November for the first time. And this is just the crest of this tsunami that is coming. It's very significant. It's very big. And look, I think both parties are ill-equipped for it. And the arguments I make are essentially that, in this country, for very understandable reasons, we sort of have this stereotypical understanding of non-white people. Is there's got to be some niche, some small silver bullet, some policy issue that defines them to get this group motivated in a way that kind of helps us politically. And it's not just the dominant culture. The media needs to do that too, to kind of explain a story, like what is the Latino vote? What do they care about? And our politicians lean into that more than anybody else because they follow the cameras and that's what the cameras want. So they follow the news. All of this to say, what's happening is what is emerging is really, I think, a story about a large swath of people who have been spoken to largely through a racial and ethnic lens that are dramatically becoming an economic populist pocketbook voter. And I say becoming only so far as they are being recognized as that. The truth is we've always been that. But as it's moving from a small niche part of our population into this rapidly growing part of the country's complexion, we're becoming more and more aware of it, especially as we're becoming less democratic voters.
Right.
There's all these changes that are happening, and people are going, "This isn't the way minority voters should be behaving." What's going on here? What is this? And so both parties, I think, as I say in the book, the Republican Party is really winning a lot of these voters despite their best efforts, not because of them. And I guess you could say that the Democrats are losing more of their voters despite their best efforts, not because of them too, because they're both just approaching this completely wrong.
Yeah, that was one of the things I want to talk about too, because you get into it in the book, which is the generational divide when it comes
Hmm.
to a political divide, and
Yeah.
that younger U.S. born Hispanic, like that whole population is shifting more rightward. So what's the drive
Mhm.
there? Is it just straight up economics?
It's a great question. Let's look under the hood a little bit.
Yeah,
Look, it is materializing in what we have been characterizing as a rightward shift. The truth of the matter is, it's really a disaffiliation with both parties. We have the weakest partisan anchors of any race or ethnicity, especially for our people under the age of 30, this massive voting group that is emerging as a new voting group. And it's why I don't say there's like a realignment, because a realignment presupposes that there were already existing positions
sure.
that they're changing from. This is just coming online as something completely different. And again, I subscribe it more to a rejection of both parties, which is manifesting naturally as more representation and more voting in the Republican Party, as opposed to these people waking up and saying, maybe I'm more pro-life, maybe I'm more anti-tax, maybe I'm more, whatever, pro-Trump. There are clearly some shades of that, but to have something of this size and magnitude emerging with younger people, third generation people, as you pointed out, is where the vast majority of the growth is happening. It's really upending, again, our just traditional notions of the way voters, young voters, minority voters, voters of color should be behaving. I'm using air quotes here.
Right.
Um, and so what I ascribe most of that to, again, is this rejection of both parties and the appeal, at least to a certain extent, of sort of more populist politics, which are front row and center on the American right, or at least what we used to call the American right. And so
Sure.
this Latino populism is going to be a defining feature of American politics for the next generation as this becomes a bigger part of the electorate.
How does that American or that Latino populism fit
Yeah,
into the America First populism
yeah.
of Trump? Because it seems the other Trump approaches to Hispanic Americans is so antithetical to the values of Hispanic and Latino voters as you describe them in the book. So how do
Yeah.
those things fit? How do those puzzle pieces fit together?
Such a great question. Um, well, there's a couple things here. Let me approach that. Let me first set the table by saying this: the two U.S. politicians that kind of exceeded conventional wisdom and polling numbers with Latinos and how they should perform were Donald Trump, right, on the right, when people kind of go, how could Donald Trump be getting 8% more in 2020? He actually did better in 16 against Hillary Clinton than Mitt Romney did against Barack Obama. So this slide has been happening for a while. And the other person was not just Donald Trump, but it was Bernie Sanders. who is winning huge numbers. Bernie Sanders won the California primary largely on the back of Latino voters against Joe Biden in 2020. A lot of this stuff gets kind of overwhelmed. These data points get overwhelmed by the broader story narratives. But as a data nerd who follows this stuff, it's kind of like, hey, there's something pretty significant happening here under the surface. There's some pretty big undertows here. Let's look at this. So Bernie Sanders, and by the way, a lot of these precincts that Bernie Sanders won were where we saw some of these biggest rightward shifts for Trump. So they were going for Bernie and then for Trump, which is a sign of not ideology, obviously. It's a sign of anti-party populism. Like the system is rigged, drain the swamp. Or my party, both parties, the system is just jacked. Like vote against it, and there's some strong resonance there. And most of this is a lot of it is generational. Some of it is racial and ethnic. A lot of it is economics, which is just like the student debt stuff and there's no job stuff, especially as it relates to U.S. born Hispanic men. Like we're not building an economy where U.S. born Hispanic men are going to be doing well over the course of their lives. And that's pretty evident, right? You can feel it when you're early 20s going, what is this going to be like? What's the next 60 years going to be like for me?
Right.
All of which is to say, sorry about Grant, the long Mike Madrid wind up, as we call it. All of this goes to say and to show that rather than sort of a rightward shift, we're really just witnessing the emergence of this populism, which both parties are now starting to kind of lean into a little bit more.
I do want to talk about immigration too, because to me, coming away from your book, only talking about Latino voters in the scope of immigration feels reductionist in the way that people talk about women voting only in the context of abortion or reproductive rights.
Precisely.
Right. But it is a part, and it's part and parcel of the Latino experience in the United States to have that mingled with immigration. So where are the feelings and thoughts moving there? And with Harris moving to the right, is that just a straight up naked play to try to get more Hispanic voters? Because she's not doing great in places like Texas or Arizona right now with those voters. We just saw polling come out where she's, winning, but sliding backwards.
Yeah. And she's going to the border in a couple of days to keep leaning into it because she has to.
Yes.
Some of the most significant rightward shifts we saw were along the border with Hispanics in the Rio Grande Valley, in southern New Mexico 2, that contestable congressional district, in Ruben Gallegos' district in southern Arizona on the border, in Imperial County, California, right on the border, which is the most heavily Hispanic county in California. So the border is an issue, and in defying our traditional understanding of this, or some people's traditional understanding, immigration has never been a top 5 issue for the Latino community, despite what the media narrative is, despite where the political focus is at. But more importantly, as it is rising on the concern and issues of minds of voters, it's for border security, not immigration reform. And I want to make this clear because this is nuanced and people kind of start jumping at me and saying, what are you doing? It doesn't mean that Latinos don't care about immigration reform. I think we do broadly as a community. I would argue more so than most other race groups and ethnicities, but we certainly don't prioritize it the way that has been discussed. And we certainly are taking a more keen interest in border security. It's why the Democrats created the House Border Security Conference earlier this year when Tom Suozzi wins this special election for the George Santos seat. Hope I'm not getting too in the weeds for this stuff.
No, you're good.
For
you're
viewers.
Good. Yeah.
But look, this is why I wrote my book, is I needed it to come out in June to tell the Democrats, if you guys don't get your act together and follow not only common sense, but the hard data, and ignore some of these ridiculous voices in your party, you're going to lose this race. And that's why I wrote the book. And again, this is not an argument for one party or the other. I think you got that sense in reading it. This is a rejection of the failure of both parties and trying to provide a roadmap on how to get back into relevance.
Sure. And I think some of that was illustrated in the 2012 Republican autopsy of Mitt Romney's loss too, because I read that when that came out. I mean, I was still in college when that came out, but it struck me in 2016 and then again in 2020 that Republicans just ignored a lot of the lessons learned from that. And also in a way too that Democrats also ignored a lot of those things. It didn't seem to them that those problems that were found in that were their problems. What is it about Harris that you think is reaching Latino voters? Is it a lived experience in terms of like the family community? I was really struck by the way that you talked about generational living, the way that
Hmm.
you know talked about your own family moving into a suburb in which that sense of community was vastly different,
Yeah.
you know, than what your abuelita, you know, had sort of
Hmm.
envisioned in a way.
Yeah.
Um, and that the quote from I think it was Becerra who said, you know, family values are more than values. And
Yeah.
I does Harris reach people in a way that Trump just is incapable of doing?
You know, you're asking. I was smirking a little bit too because the question about the autopsy. I just wrote a piece on this on my Substack last night. Because and I'm surprised people still remember it as much as I do, but of course they do. You know, let's start with the autopsy because it
Yeah.
was really important. And what I argue in the piece that I just put up is that the Republican autopsy was right, but it was right for the wrong reasons. And that wrong reason was the predicate, the foundational argument was established by the Democrats who were also wrong. And now they're dealing with the blowback. And so what does that mean, Mike? Well, the Republican autopsy basically said we need to diversify this party. We can't if we don't get more than just white old Christian dudes, we're in trouble. And the demographic leviathan that was coming, this tsunami, was Hispanic, it was Latino. So it's like we need to lean into immigration reform because the Democrats are winning because of immigration reform. And I was there in 2012 going to say that's not, you're right, you need to diversify the party, but that's not the way you do it. And what they were both doing was creating essentially a policy issue to speak to Latinos as an aggrieved racial and ethnic group. When all of the data was saying it's the economics, it's the economy, stupid. Like all of it was saying to both parties, like screaming. It wasn't close. It wasn't like one poll here, one poll there. It's like every poll for the past 30 years by wide margins was saying, we came for jobs. We want jobs. We want economic opportunity. You know, we're not, that's what we want. You know, immigration is usually sixth or seventh on the list. And so both parties begin this mistaken political strategy, true political malpractice of doubling down on immigration as an issue. Remember, Marco Rubio is on the cover of Time as the savior of the party. He puts together the Gang of Eight, a Republican proposal for immigration reform. He abandons it literally on a Friday night before it becomes public and says, like, I didn't have anything to do with it after he spent like 8 months leading it because the Republican base was like, we don't want this. What are you doing? Get out of here.
Yeah.
And so right after the Republican autopsy, you know, Trump emerges. It's like this is the exact opposite of what we need. But ironically, Grant, the Republican Party is more diverse under Donald Trump than it was under Mitt Romney. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is the racial narrative, which has consumed the Democratic Party, the non-white racial narrative, and our media, is not where Latinos are at or have ever been at. So they're acting like an economic populist voter responding to economic populist issues and an economic populist candidate. And the country's going, what is happening? How can this be happening? Don't they know they want to deport them and split their families and put their kids in cages? And the Latinos are like, man, I just need to pay rent on Friday. I just don't want my job shut down on the construction site. And I'm voting for somebody who's going to be defending those industries from their perspective, real or perceived. And so that, you know, when we talk about Kamala trying to crash back into this, the Democrats have a really big working class problem. And it's big, and it's been going on for over a decade. And most Democrats are kind of shocked that like we're the working class party. We're the party of FDR. We're the party of unions. But the working class hasn't believed that for 30 or 40 years.
Right.
And they're increasingly voting that way.
Right.
So Kamala's numbers have come back into line. She's still not where Biden was in 2020 with Latinos, by the way. And 2020 was a historically bad performance. So she's not even quite to the bad performance level yet. And there should be more alarm bells going off about this in the Democratic Party. But this is the third presidential cycle where I'm seeing more denial than I'm seeing acceptance and trying to acknowledge it, at least from the political chattering class. You are seeing the campaign actually doing the right things. The question is, can they break through 10 or 15 years of bad branding to get to where they need to in the next 40, 50 days?
Well, Mike, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. No, you bet. I hope it didn't go on too long. It was a pleasure, and let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely. I want to thank Mike again for coming on the show. A link to his book and his brand new Substack, which is also excellent, are in the show notes. I'm not getting any money or a kickback for this. This is just one of those books that if you're a political person, it should be on your shelf. Okay, now it's time for TLTO, or Too Long Tuned Out, where I tell you just the stuff you need to know from the stuff you just heard. And I know today is a TLTO kind of day because it was a lot. So, Donald Trump's immigration plan can really be more accurately described as an anti-immigration plan. He wants to divert billions of dollars in military spending to put U.S. troops on the southern border and send ICE agents into states and cities to conduct raids that would also include bringing in the National Guard and deputizing local law enforcement. He wants to use those raids to hold 11 million undocumented immigrants in large camps along the U.S. southern border and deport all of them, a decision that immigration and economic experts say would be a disaster for the U.S. economy. He also wants to end birthright citizenship, a part of the U.S. Constitution, and start an ideological screening for only extremist Muslim immigrants, reinstate the Muslim ban, and deport pro-Palestinian students. Kamala Harris's immigration plan is pretty thin. It relies heavily on a bipartisan bill that was killed in Congress earlier this year. It would hire more Border Patrol agents and put in trigger markers to stop entries when they reach $5,000 a day. It would also make seeking asylum more difficult. But the bill would also hire more asylum officers, judges, and lawyers for children. It would raise the number of people allowed to get green cards and make a pathway to citizenship for 10,000 Afghan allies. It would also make ICE have clear alternatives to government detention centers, while also raising the number of beds in those centers. However, Harris doesn't have an official plan up about a pathway to citizenship, though she did say that she supports one, at least in the abstract. But like I said before, it's a safe bet that tomorrow's mini is going to be about her trip to the border today. And that is it for today's Make It Make Sense. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. It really helps spread the word about it. Subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. We'll have an extended interview with Mike Madrid up tomorrow. It's a really, really good interview. There was a bunch packed into it that I just couldn't put in this episode, so you're not going to want to miss out on that. It's just $5 a month, and you get access to a bunch of other content, including the forthcoming voter guide that I'll be putting out hopefully here in the next week or so. I'm not quite done writing it yet. Also, like and subscribe on YouTube and share the show on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. You can tag me in that. I'm at Grant Herms on X and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.